They locked her in at 8:47 p.m. and walked away laughing. Maggie Lawson heard the click before she understood what it meant. She had slipped into the restroom off the Harrington Estates marble corridor for exactly 4 minutes. 4 minutes to breathe, to let her feet stop screaming inside her catering shoes, to press cold water against her wrists and remember why she had agreed to do this alone. 6 hours of baking. 300 desserts. Every macaron level, every tart glazed, every petit four arranged with the specific care of someone who understood that food was the only thing at an event like this that was actually real. He tried the handle. Locked. She tried again, harder, then with both hands, then with her shoulder against the door in the specific way of a person who already knows it won't open but needs to exhaust the options before accepting the situation. The door was solid mahogany. The lock was the heavy kind that required a key from outside. The kind that did not lock itself. Through the gap at the bottom she heard it, the sound retreating down the marble corridor. Heels. Multiple pairs, the specific rhythm of women who had rehearsed moving together. And underneath the heel click, fading laughter. The bright particular laughter of people who have just done something and found it satisfying. Ashley Harrington's laugh was the highest. Maggie recognized it because she had heard it at 3 separate events this year, had each one directed eventually at her. Ashley had a gift for finding the moment when someone was most exposed and making sure the room noticed. Tonight the room was a marble corridor. The exposure was a locked door. The someone was Maggie. She sat down on the tiled floor because standing was using the energy she needed for thinking. The restroom smelled of expensive soap and the lily arrangement on the counter that had cost more than Maggie's weekly profit margin. The light was the warm amber of a venue that had spent considerable money making everything look like a painting, which meant the restroom looked like a painting too, which meant Maggie was sitting on the floor of a painting that no one was going to open. She knocked on the door. Twice. Waited. Knocked again. Nothing. She pulled out her phone. 2 bars, which was 2 more than she'd feared. She called the event coordinator voicemail. She called the number on the catering contract, rang out. She looked at her contacts for someone who was actually inside the Harrington estate right now and realized, with the specific coldness of a thing you already knew about yourself but had been avoiding, that she had no one. She had come alone because she always worked alone. She had no assistant, no partner, no one who would notice an absence. Nobody was looking for her. She pressed her back against the cool mahogany and looked at the lily arrangement and thought about her father's bakery on Clement Street, which smelled of butter and warm sugar and the particular early morning quiet of a place that existed to feed people. She thought about the way he used to say that a good baker shows up, and she had been showing up for 2 years since she lost him. To every event, every contract, every 6-hour solo catering job in a venue where she was the only person without a designer dress. She thought about the letter that had arrived last week from the Harrington Development Group's legal team. 3rd letter. Each one more specific than the last about the building on Clement Street that her father had left her. Each one describing the sale in terms that suggested it had already happened and she simply hadn't cooperated yet. Why did Ashley Harrington personally lock a caterer in a restroom? That was the question sitting underneath the floor tile and the lily smell and the locked door. Not the cruelty. Maggie had catalogued Ashley's cruelty across 3 events and understood it as a personality feature rather than a specific response. The specific targeting. The deliberate escalation. What did Ashley Harrington need badly enough to personally make sure Maggie understood her position? She was still sitting with the question when she heard footsteps outside the door. Different from Ashley's circle. One set measured, not heels. The specific even pace of someone who walked like they owned whatever floor they were crossing. A knock. Not the polite social knock of someone checking a door. 3 times firm, the knock of someone who already knew someone was in there. Ms. Lawson. A man's voice. Level, unhurried, carrying through mahogany without effort. My name is Ethan Cross. I'm going to have this door opened. She stood up. Her heart was doing something she didn't have time for. How do you know my name? A brief pause. Your dessert table has been unattended for 40 minutes. In my experience, a baker who has spent 6 hours on 300 desserts does not simply walk away from them. Another pause. I asked my security team to find out why. She stared at the door. A man who had noticed her dessert table was unattended. A man who had a security team. A man who was now, from the sound of it, producing a key, where had he gotten a key, and turning it in the lock. The door opened. Ethan Cross was standing in the marble corridor in a dark suit with the expression of a man who had assessed the situation completely and was now simply in the execution phase. He looked at her, not with pity, not with the social performance of concern, but with the direct attention of someone taking inventory. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. "Just, no." He stepped back to give her room to exit. She walked out into the corridor. The marble was cold under her catering shoes. The corridor smelled of the same expensive lily arrangement from inside, reproduced at intervals along the walls. "Who locked you in?" he said. She looked at him. "Why does that matter to you?" He held her gaze with something that was not quite a smile and not quite its absence. "Because it happened at an event I'm attending. And because the person who did it walked away laughing." He paused. "I heard them from the east hallway." He had heard them. He had followed the sound or the absence of her, and had come down a marble corridor to unlock a door for a woman he did not know. What was Ethan Cross doing at a Harrington charity gala? And what did he want that had brought him to a corridor where a caterer had been locked in a restroom? The question was still forming when he said, "Your table needs attending. And I think you should know something about this evening that you currently don't." Ethan Cross had not come to the Harrington charity gala for the food. He had come because Richard Harrington was 3 weeks into negotiating a port contract that overlapped directly with his organization's shipping infrastructure, and nothing in that negotiation moved without Ethan's eyes on it. He had been at the gala for 2 hours, managing the specific patience required of a man who had to be present without being the reason for presence, when his head of security, a quiet man named Reeves, had appeared at his elbow. "The caterer is missing," Reeves had said. Ethan had looked at the dessert table. 300 pieces, perfectly arranged, not a single one disturbed yet because the event had not reached the dessert portion of its arc. The caterer's equipment was still staged near the service entrance. Her jacket was on the chair behind the table. Nobody walked away from a jacket they'd been working in for 6 hours. "Find her," Ethan had said. What Reeves found instead was the group of women returning from the east corridor, straightening their expressions as they re-entered the main hall. Ashley Harrington at the center of the group, her smile the specific smile of someone who has just done something and is not particularly concerned about being seen to have done it. Ethan had gone to find the caterer himself. Now he was standing in the main hall beside Maggie Lawson while she straightened her catering jacket and tried to decide whether to return to her table or to the 6-hour investment of work that Ashley Harrington's crowd was currently moving toward with champagne flutes. "Eat something first," he said. She looked at him. "Excuse me. You've been working for 6 hours. You should eat something before you go back to work." He flagged a passing server, took 2 items from the tray, small, savory, not from Maggie's table, and held one out. She stared at it for a moment. "Then I took it." "You're very direct for someone I met 4 minutes ago." "I've been told that," he said. He held her gaze while she ate, which should have been uncomfortable and wasn't. "Tell me about the Clement Street property." She stopped chewing. "What?" "The building your father left you. The one the Harrington Development Group has sent you 3 letters about." He watched her absorb the fact that he knew this. "Richard Harrington needs that property for the port expansion footprint. The expansion that connects to the shipping contract he is currently negotiating with my organization." Maggie looked at him with the specific expression of a person reorienting a room that has just changed its furniture. "You know about the letters." "I know about the port expansion," he said. "The letters are a logical extension of what I know about Richard Harrington's acquisition methods." He held her gaze steadily. "He has done this before. 3 other properties, 3 other owners. The buildings were acquired through a combination of legal pressure and what was later described in one civil case as coordinated harassment." "Ashley locking me in that restroom," Maggie said slowly. "That's not cruelty. That's a message." "Yes. They want me to understand my position before I get another letter." "Yes," Ethan said. "The 4th letter will contain a formal legal notice. A zoning claim filed against the building. It's been prepared. My contact at City Planning flagged it last week." She looked at him. "Why does your contact at City Planning tell you about Harrington zoning claims?" He held her gaze without any of the social deflection that question normally produced in people who had something to conceal. "Because I pay attention to everything that intersects with my interests. And Richard Harrington's port expansion intersects with my shipping infrastructure." which means his acquisition methods have been on my information list for 4 months. That's not a complete answer, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She held his gaze for a long moment. The main hall around them was doing what charity galas did, performing generosity loudly in silk with champagne, and in the middle of it, a woman who had been locked in a restroom 40 minutes ago and a man who had come to find her were having a conversation that had nothing to do with desserts or charity. What do you want from me? She said. Direct. The directness of someone who had learned that the question was always better asked than assumed. Nothing yet, he said. I want you to understand the situation you're in before the 4th letter arrives. He paused. And I'd like to know if you have documentation of the 3 letters you've already received. I keep everything, she said. Every letter, every voicemail, every conversation I've written down afterward. My father was a baker. He always said, document what matters. She held his gaze. Why? Before he could answer, Ashley Harrington materialized from across the room, moving toward the dessert table with 3 people in her orbit and the specific bright energy of a woman who had expected a caterer to have disappeared and was noticing that the caterer had not. Her eyes found Maggie, then found the man standing beside Maggie. Ashley's smile underwent a recalibration so fast it was almost invisible. Almost. Ethan watched Ashley recognize him. Watched the recalibration. His expression did not change. Miss Harrington, he said. Level. Carrying. The specific tone of a name used as punctuation. Ashley's smile completed itself through visible effort. Mr. Cross. I didn't realize you were. I didn't know you'd met our caterer. She does exceptional work, Ethan said. He looked at Maggie's dessert table. 300 pieces. All of it done alone. He looked back at Ashley. She's very talented. Ashley held her smile for 3 seconds. Then said, of course, and moved away with her orbit intact and her expression doing something that was not the specific satisfied performance of cocktail hour. Something colder. Something that meant the evening had developed a variable she had not planned for. Maggie looked at Ethan. He was looking at Ashley's retreating group with an expression that was doing something beneath its controlled surface. Something she could not fully read yet but that she filed alongside everything else she was filing about this man who had noticed her dessert table and followed the absence to a locked door. You just made yourself a problem for them, she said. They made themselves my problem first, he said. He turned to her. Go back to your table. I'll find you before the evening ends. You don't need to. I know, he said. I'm going anyway. He walked back toward the main hall with the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided something and was not revisiting the decision. Maggie stood beside her dessert table in her catering jacket and her aching feet and the specific disorienting warmth of being found by someone who had gone looking. Nobody had gone looking for her before. Why had Ethan Cross? And what did he know about the Harrington family that he hadn't yet told her? She found him at the East Terrace at 10:15. After the desserts were gone and the equipment was packed and the Harrington Estates staff had begun the efficient process of returning the marble hall to its permanent state of expensive emptiness. She had told herself she was looking for the exit. She was not looking for the exit. He was standing at the terrace railing with a glass of water. Not champagne, she noted, looking at the garden below with the specific stillness of a man whose mind was working harder than his body was showing. You said you'd find me, she said. I said before the evening ended. He turned. It ends in approximately 12 minutes by my estimate. You found me first. She held her equipment bag and looked at him in the terrace light. Cooler out here, the sound of the gala muffled by the glass doors behind her. The garden below smelling of night-blooming jasmine and the damp cold of October. The contrast between this and the marble warmth inside made the terrace feel like a room that had been removed from the event on purpose. You know something else, she said. About the Harrington situation. Something you didn't say inside. He set his glass on the railing. I turned to face her fully. The zoning claim I mentioned, the one my city planning contact flagged. It was filed using my contact's credentials. She processed that. Someone filed a fraudulent claim against my building using credentials belonging to someone inside your network. Yes. Your city contact. Was used, Ethan said. The controlled surface was present but something beneath it had moved. One degree of something that was not the executive calm but the specific reaction of a man who has discovered his own network turned against someone without his knowledge. He was working on both sides. Accepting payment from Harrington's legal team to file the claim while maintaining his position in my information network. He held her gaze. He didn't know I would connect the claim to you. But you did. When Reeves told me the caterer was missing and I identified you as Maggie Lawson from Clement Street Bakery, I made the connection. He paused. The claim was filed 3 days ago. It moves to the planning board in 2 weeks unless it's challenged. Maggie set her equipment bag down on the terrace floor. The night jasmine smell was very present here, sweet and cold. She looked at the garden below, dark shapes of hedges and paths, a fountain she could hear but not see. You're telling me, she said carefully, that a fraudulent zoning claim against my father's building was filed by someone inside your organization, at the request of the Harrington family, and you only found out tonight. Yes. And you're telling me this because you deserve to know, he said, simply. And because whoever told me to pay attention to Harrington's port expansion activities clearly didn't factor in that those activities would include using my own network against a woman who bakes desserts for a living. Something in the way he said it, not anger, not performance, something colder and more internal, made her understand that whatever Ethan Cross was feeling about the discovery of his contact's betrayal was not entirely professional. My father built that bakery, Maggie said. He built it from nothing over 30 years in a building that was falling apart when he bought it. He fixed it himself. Every weekend for 2 years he fixed it himself. She looked at her hands. The flower-familiar hands that had spent 6 hours producing 300 pieces that a room full of people had eaten without once wondering who made them. He left it to me because he knew I'd keep it. You will keep it, Ethan said. You sound very certain about something you just learned tonight. I'm certain about the zoning claim, he said. It won't survive a challenge if the challenge comes from the right direction. He held her gaze. I'm also certain that the documentation you have, the 3 letters, the voicemails, everything you've kept, is more valuable than you currently understand. Why? He stepped closer. Not crowded. Closing the specific distance between 2 people who have been talking through a gap and have decided the gap is unnecessary. The night jasmine smell and the cold October air and the muffled sound of the gala through the glass doors, all of it held still around them for one moment. Because the Harrington family has done this before, he said. 3 times. 3 other buildings, 3 other owners. The pattern is documented if you know where to look. Your letters are the 4th instance. Combined with the fraudulent zoning claim filed using stolen credentials from my network. He paused. That's not a property dispute. That's criminal coordination. Maggie looked at him. You're not just helping me keep my building, she said. You're building something against the Harrington family. He held her gaze. I'm correcting a situation that should not have been created using my network. Pause. The fact that correcting it also helps you keep your building is convenient, she said. Accurate, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. The garden fountain continued its sound below. The gala behind them produced its muffled noise. And on the terrace, between the jasmine smell and the cold air and the specific quality of his attention, which was the furthest thing from the way people usually looked at a woman who carried equipment bags to events where she was never the guest, something settled in Maggie's chest that she did not yet have a name for but recognized as the opposite of the locked door. What do you need from me? She said. Your documentation, he said. Everything you have. And access to your father's bakery files if anything there goes back further than the letters. There's a filing cabinet in the back office, she said. My father kept records of everything the building went through. Permits, repairs, correspondence. She paused. I haven't gone through it since he died. When can you get to it? Tomorrow morning, she said. I open at 6. He picked up his water glass from the railing. I'll be there at 7. She almost said you don't have to. He didn't. Because he had found her in a locked restroom and stood beside her dessert table and told her things she needed to know and was now proposing to be at her bakery at 7 in the morning, and none of it felt like obligation. It felt like someone deciding she was worth showing up for. She wasn't used to that. She was going to have to get used to that. She had the specific feeling, standing on a terrace that smelled of night jasmine, that she was going to have the opportunity. But behind the glass doors, Ashley Harrington was watching the terrace with an expression that had moved completely past social calculation into something that looked very much like damage control. And she was on her phone. Clement Street Bakery smelled of butter and cardamom and the warm yeast and sugar combination that Maggie's father had described as the smell of showing up. She had been opening this bakery at 6 every morning for 2 years, and the smell had never once failed to arrive before she did, as though the building itself produced it regardless of whether anyone was there to receive it. She had the first batch in the oven and the coffee made when Ethan arrived at 7 exactly. No security visible, she checked because she was paying attention now, and found one man at the corner who was too still to be a pedestrian. She appreciated the honesty of the one. She set a coffee on the counter without asking how he took it and put milk and sugar beside it so he could decide. He added neither. Picked up the cup. Looked around the bakery with the specific attention he brought to everything, taking in the chalkboard menu, the worn wooden counter, the photographs on the east wall of her father at various stages of the bakery's history. He built this, Ethan said. Not a question. Every detail, she said. The shelving is his. The counter is his. The oven is the third one, he replaced the first 2 himself. She held her own coffee. He said the building taught him what it needed. Ethan looked at the photographs for a moment longer than she expected. Something moved across his expression, not the controlled surface she had been reading since the terrace, but something underneath it that was personal and specific and not performed. The filing cabinet is in the back, she said. The back office smelled of old paper and the residual warmth of the oven coming through the wall. The filing cabinet was her father's, gray metal, 4 drawers, labeled in his handwriting across decades of faded tape. She had not opened it since the funeral. She opened it now because Ethan Cross was standing in her bakery at 7 in the morning and she was paying attention to what people did before they were asked. The bottom drawer held property records going back 31 years. She pulled the folders. Handed them to Ethan. He set his coffee on the desk and opened the first folder and began reading with the specific focused quiet of someone who was not performing attention but actually exercising it. He went back to the oven. Pulled the first batch. Set them to cool. Came back. Here, Ethan said. He had not looked up. He was holding a document, yellowed paper typed rather than printed, dated 19 years ago. The building's original zoning variance. Your father applied for it to expand the retail footprint. I know, she said. He talked about it. It took 3 years to get approved. The variance was co-signed by a city planning officer named Gerald Marsh. Ethan looked up. Gerald Marsh is the predecessor of the contact who filed the fraudulent claim against your building last week. He retired 8 years ago. The current contact inherited his files. He held her gaze. Which means the Harrington family's relationship with that planning office goes back at least 19 years. They knew the access point. They used it on the previous 3 acquisitions. They used it again on yours. Maggie sat down in her father's office chair. The old paper smell was around her, and the warmth from the oven and the weight of a filing cabinet that had been holding this information for 19 years while she simply hadn't known to look. 3 other families, she said. I have the names from my research, Ethan said. But I'm missing the pattern documentation, the specific evidence that the Harrington family coordinated the zoning claims rather than simply benefiting from them. He set the document on the desk. Your father's variance application is the earliest evidence I have of their connection to that planning office. Combined with the 3 letters you've received and the fraudulent claim filed last week. It's a pattern, she said. 4 acquisitions, same method, same planning office access point. Yes. He looked at her. It's enough to take to a federal investigator with jurisdiction over municipal fraud. It's enough to collapse the zoning claim against your building before the planning board hearing. And it's enough to connect the Harrington port expansion to a decade of coordinated property fraud. He paused. With one more thing. What? The other 3 families, he said. If any of them kept documentation, letters, communications, anything, their records combined with yours creates a prosecutable pattern rather than a single contested case. He held her gaze. Do you know if they kept records? I don't know them, she said. I do, he said. I can make contacts. But the conversation is better coming from someone who is also affected. Someone who isn't. He paused, choosing carefully. What I am. She looked at him across her father's desk in the warm paper smell of the back office. You mean someone they'd trust? Yes. She absorbed this. Built forward from it. You want me to contact 3 families who lost their buildings to the Harrington method and ask them to submit documentation to a federal investigator. I want you to have the option to do that, he said. I'm not asking you to do it for me. Who are you asking me to do it for? He held her gaze. For your father's building, he said. And for the 3 families who didn't get to keep theirs. The oven timer went off in the front of the bakery. The second batch. Maggie stood up, went to the front, pulled the tray, set it to cool with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times and found the repetition clarifying rather than numbing. When she came back, Ethan was on his phone. A short call, 3 sentences, in exchange she caught the edges of but not the center. He put the phone away and looked at her. The planning board hearing, he said. It's been moved up. 2 days from now instead of 2 weeks. The cold moved through her. Ashley. Someone accelerated the timeline, he said. His jaw set in the way she was learning to read. One controlled degree of something that lived just below fury. They know we've connected. They're trying to move the claim through before we can build the challenge. Can we challenge each other in 2 days? Only if the other 3 families can be reached today. He held her gaze. And only if there's nothing in that filing cabinet that the Harrington team might use to complicate your ownership documentation. She looked at the filing cabinet. 4 drawers. 31 years of her father's careful record-keeping. Then we'd better start reading, she said. He pulled the second drawer. He took the third. And in the warm paper and butter smell of her father's back office, they began building the thing that was going to save the building. But outside on Clement Street, a car had been parked for 20 minutes that had not been there when the bakery opened. And the person inside it was on a phone call that was going to change the shape of the next 48 hours in ways neither Maggie nor Ethan had yet accounted for. The eviction notice arrived at noon. Not the zoning claim, that was the planning board's process. This was different. A formal notice of ownership dispute, hand-delivered to the bakery's front door by a process server who arrived while 3 customers were at the counter and Maggie was in the middle of explaining the difference between a financier and a friend to a woman who had asked twice already. The process server left it on the counter. Maggie finished explaining. Waited for the customer to take her bag and leave. Then read the notice. It claimed that the Clement Street building had been purchased by a Harrington Development subsidiary through an estate proceeding that had not properly included Maggie as a beneficiary, that the building had been sold to cover estate debts before her father's will could be fully executed, and that the subsequent transfer to Maggie constituted a title error. She read it twice. 3 times. Then she called Ethan. He arrived in 14 minutes. She handed him the notice without speaking. He read it once. She watched his face, which showed nothing on the surface and showed everything underneath, in the specific way she had learned to read him over 2 days of filing cabinets and contact calls, and the 3 families who had all 3 kept documentation and had agreed to submit it and had done so yesterday afternoon through a federal contact Ethan had connected them with. He put the notice on the counter. This is fabricated, he said. I know it's fabricated, she said. My father's estate went through probate cleanly. I have the court documents. The building was transferred to me without dispute 18 months ago. She held his gaze. Which means whoever filed this either doesn't know I have the probate records or doesn't care because they're betting I can't challenge it fast enough. Both, Ethan said. He was on his phone. A call that lasted 45 seconds and contained instructions she could only partially hear from across the counter. He put the phone away. My attorney will file an emergency response with the estate court by 3 o'clock. The notice is fraudulent. Probably on the face of your probate documents. It won't hold. But it's meant to scare me, she said. Yes. And to occupy my attention while the planning board hearing proceeds tomorrow. She looked at him. While I'm dealing with a fraudulent ownership dispute, I can't be preparing the zoning challenge. They're trying to split your focus, he said. Is it working? He looked at her. Does it look like it's working? She held his gaze steadily. No, she said. It doesn't. Because I've been preparing for the planning board hearing since yesterday morning and the probate documents are already in my email and I can forward them to your attorney in 30 seconds. She picked up her phone. What's the address? Something moved across Ethan's face. The specific expression she had seen on the terrace and in the back office and at the filing cabinet, arriving again now. A man who has been surprised by something and is not accustomed to being surprised, and finds the specific direction of his surprise clarifying rather than unsettling. She forwarded the documents. He watched her do it. The bakery was quiet now. No customers, the afternoon lull that came between 2 and 4 when Clement Street slowed and the light changed to something lower and more amber than morning. Maggie, he said. Don't tell me to be careful, she said. I've been careful for 2 years. It hasn't stopped any of this. I wasn't going to tell you to be careful, he said. I was going to tell you that the federal contact confirmed this morning that the documentation from the 3 other families, combined with yours, constitutes a prosecutable case. It goes to the investigator tomorrow morning, 2 hours before the planning board hearing. She absorbed this. If the federal case is filed before the hearing, the planning board will see it on their dockets. A zoning claim connected to an active federal fraud investigation is not something planning boards move forward on. He held her gaze. The hearing will be postponed pending federal review, which means the zoning claim stalls, which means the eviction notice, already fraudulent, has no supporting action behind it, which means they're out of moves, she said. For now, he said. Ashley and Richard Harrington still have resources. This isn't over. I know. She picked up a cooling rack and moved it to the back without thinking. The specific automatic movement of someone whose hands found useful work during significant conversations. What does Richard Harrington do when his moves stop working? He escalates, Ethan said. He had followed her to the doorway between the counter and the back, which put him closer than he had been in the bakery before. The kitchen warmth and the butter smell and the specific proximity of 2 people who had spent 2 days working through crisis together and had not yet discussed what the proximity had become. He will try to discredit you before the federal case becomes public. How? Your license, your reputation, your professional record. He held her gaze. He'll look for something to use. There's nothing to use, she said. I know. He looked at her directly. I checked. She stared at him. You ran a background check on me. I ran a professional review, he said. Before I brought you into anything connected to my organization's interests, I needed to know who you were. He held her gaze without flinching. What I found was a woman with a spotless professional record, a bakery that has been profitable every quarter since she inherited it, and the documentation habits of someone who was trained by a father who believed in keeping records. He paused. I'm telling you because you deserve to know I did it, not because I found anything concerning. She was quiet for a moment. Processing. The kitchen warmth held them. Outside, Clement Street had its afternoon light and its ordinary momentum, and its car that she noticed was still parked in the same position it had been at noon. Ethan, she said. The car outside. Gray sedan. It's been there since before the process server. He turned. Looked through the bakery window in a way that covered the action with ordinary movement. His jaw set. Don't look at it again, he said quietly. Go to the back. Stay away from the window. What is it? Harrington's people, checking whether the notice rattled you enough to leave. He was already on his phone. A different call, faster than the attorney call, shorter. They want to know if you're still here and still building the challenge. He looked at her. Go to the back. I'll handle this. I'm not hiding in my own bakery, she said. I'm not asking you to hide, he said. The controlled surface was entirely gone now. What she saw was direct, immediate, the specific face of a man who has identified a threat to something he has decided matters and is in the execution of protecting it. I'm asking you to give me 60 seconds. He went to the back. 60 seconds passed. He counted them. When she came out, the gray sedan was gone. Ethan was at the counter with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who has resolved something he is not going to describe in detail. What did you do? She said. I made a phone call, he said. That's not a complete answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. He held her gaze. Are you all right? I'm fine. She set her hands on the counter. I've been fine through everything. Through the locked door and the letters and the fraudulent claim and the ownership notice. I'm fine. She held his gaze. What I am not is willing to be watched through a window in my own bakery. I know, he said. That won't happen again. You can't promise that. I just did, he said. Simply. The voice of a man who said things he meant and meant things he said and had built an entire operational existence on the difference between those 2 categories. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light in the bakery came through the front window in a long amber stripe across the wooden counter. The butter smell was present. The cooling rack behind her held 12 pieces she hadn't packaged yet. "Stay for coffee," she said. "I'll tell you what I found in the third drawer of the filing cabinet that I haven't told you yet." He sat down at the counter. She made coffee. And whatever the gray sedan represented, and whatever Ethan's phone call had resolved, and whatever was coming next from the Harrington family, all of it waited on the other side of the amber light while two people sat at a bakery counter in the specific warmth of a place that had been built to feed people and had for 2 days been building something else entirely. She set the coffee down and reached under the counter for a folder that she had pulled from the third drawer the previous afternoon and had not yet shown anyone. She placed it between them. "My father applied for a business expansion loan 19 years ago," she said. "Through the city's small business development program. The application was denied." She opened the folder. The denial letter cites a zoning complication on the property. A flag on the building's expansion variance. She held his gaze. The flag was filed by the same planning office contact, Gerald Marsh, the predecessor. 19 years ago. Ethan looked at the denial letter. Then at her. "They've been suppressing this building's development potential for 19 years, he said. "My father spent 3 years fighting the variance approval that should have been routine. He never knew why it was complicated. He thought it was bureaucracy." She held the folder. It wasn't bureaucracy. They were keeping the building from increasing in value so that when they were ready to acquire it, the price would be lower. "And the timing," Ethan said. "The port expansion planning started 4 years ago," she said. "Which is when the letters to me started. Which is when they were ready." She held his gaze. "They've been managing this building's value for 19 years in preparation for taking it." Ethan was very still. She had been watching him across 2 days of significant information and understood his stillness as the specific response of a man whose mind was working harder than his body showed. This stillness was different, deeper, more personal. The expression of someone who has just understood that a situation is older and more deliberate than they realized. "Your father never knew," he said. "No," she said. "He thought the bureaucracy was just the bureaucracy." She closed the folder. "He spent 30 years building something on a foundation that was being managed by people he didn't know existed." She looked at her hands on the counter. "He died not knowing." The bakery was quiet around them. The afternoon light had shifted, later now less amber, more gray at the edges. The butter smell was still present, constant, the specific signature of the building that her father had fixed one weekend at a time. "Maggie," Ethan said. Her name, the way he had used it on the terrace. Direct, specific, carrying something that was not the executive tone. She looked up. "What he built survived," Ethan said. 30 years of deliberate suppression and it survived. Because he documented everything. Because you kept the documentation." He held her gaze. "The building is still here. Everything they did to manage it, and it's still here." She held his gaze. The thing that arrived in her chest was not the warmth of being comforted. She had been offered comfort before from people who meant well and stayed briefly. This was different. This was the specific warmth of being seen accurately by someone who had paid sufficient attention to see correctly. "There's something else in the folder," she said. He waited. She turned to the last page. A letter, handwritten, dated 16 years ago. Her father's handwriting. The specific large, deliberate letters of a man who had taught himself to write as an adult. "He knew something was wrong," she said. "He didn't know what. He wrote this to himself. A note about the pattern he was seeing. The same planning officer, the same complications, the same delays. He wrote it down because he said that's what you did when something didn't add up. You wrote it down so there was a record." Ethan read the handwritten letter. When he looked up, his expression had moved completely past the controlled surface into something that was direct and unguarded and carried the specific weight of a man who has just been handed something he hadn't known he needed. "He was right," Ethan said. "He saw it. He just didn't have enough pieces to see the whole picture." "We have enough pieces now," Maggie said. "Yes," he said. "We do." She looked at him. "I want to ask you something directly." "Ask it." "When this is over, when the federal case is filed and the zoning claim collapses and the Harrington family is out of moves, what happens to you and me?" She held his gaze. "Are we still talking?" He held her gaze for a long, complete moment. The bakery held its butter smell and its gray-edged light and the folder on the counter between them. Yes, he said. No qualifier. No strategic frame. The voice of a man saying something he had already decided. We're still talking. She nodded. Put the folder back under the counter. Picked up her coffee. Then here's what I haven't told you yet, she said. The third drawer had one more file. A correspondence folder going back 22 years. Letters between my father and the previous owner of this building from before he bought it. She looked at him. The previous owner mentions in 2 letters a conversation he had with a man named Harrington about acquiring the property. He declined. 6 months later, the building developed a zoning complication that made it difficult to sell to anyone else. She held his gaze. And then my father bought it below market because it was the only offer the previous owner received. Ethan went completely still. The Harrington family, he said slowly, has been trying to acquire this specific building for 22 years. Since before my father bought it, Maggie said. Since before I was born. She looked at the east wall where her father's photographs lived. They created the conditions that made it affordable for him. They planned to acquire it from him. He survived them for 30 years without knowing they existed. She looked back at Ethan. And now I have 22 years of documentation proving a coordinated, multi-decade property suppression campaign by the Harrington family against a single building on Clement Street. Ethan looked at the folder under the counter. Then he looked at her. That's not a zoning dispute, he said. That's a criminal conspiracy. Yes, she said. I know. She held his gaze. Who do we call first? The federal investigators arrived at Harrington Development Group's offices at 9:15 on a Thursday morning. Not with the drama of a raid, with the quiet, specific authority of people who had everything they needed and had come to formalize it. The documentation package Maggie had assembled, 22 years of correspondence, 3 families' parallel records, the fraudulent zoning claim filed through stolen credentials, the fabricated ownership dispute, and her father's handwritten note about the pattern he had seen and recorded, had reached the federal investigator 48 hours earlier and had been described, in the investigator's own communication to Ethan's attorney, as the most comprehensive municipal fraud documentation she had received in 19 years of practice. Maggie was in her bakery when Ethan called. 6 in the morning, first batch in the oven, the specific early quiet of Clement Street before the city fully woke. They're there now, he said. She turned the mixer off so she could hear him clearly. The bakery held its butter smell and the sound of her own breathing and the low dawn light coming through the front window. Richard Harrington, she said. In his office. His attorney is present. The investigators have the full package. Pause. The port contract negotiation is suspended pending the federal review. The planning board has formally removed the zoning claim from their docket. The ownership dispute notice has been vacated by the estate court. Maggie stood in her bakery kitchen with flour on her hands and the mixer silent beside her, and 22 years of her father's building's history resolved in the span of a 9-minute phone call. The other 3 families, she said, were notified this morning, Ethan said. Their documentation is formally part of the federal case. They'll receive individual notifications from the investigator's office about the status of their properties. Pause. The Harrington family's acquisition method for those 3 buildings is now under active review. Recovery is possible for 2 of them. She exhaled. Put her hand against the kitchen wall. The wall her father had built and repaired and maintained across 30 years of not knowing what was behind the pressure on his building. The wall was warm from the oven. Ashley Harrington, she said. A brief pause. Cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced personal liability finding. She was aware of the property strategy. She was not the architect of it. Another pause. Her social standing is a separate matter. The news is going to be public before noon. Maggie thought about the charity gala. About the marble corridor and the locked restroom and the click of the key and the heels and the laughter fading. About sitting on a tile floor in an expensive lily smell and knocking on mahogany while nobody came. She's going to lose everything she used to do, Maggie said. Yes, Ethan said. She is. She nodded. Went back to the mixer. Started it again. Ethan, she said over the sound of it. Yes. Thank you for finding me. A pause that held more than a pause usually held. Thank you for having a filing cabinet. She almost laughed. The almost laugh became an actual one, unguarded, the specific laugh of a woman who had spent 2 weeks in crisis and had come out the other side of it with her building, her father's records, and a man who had walked down a marble corridor to unlock a restroom door because a dessert table had been unattended for 40 minutes. The first batch came out of the oven. She set it to cool. Looked at the front window, Clement Street in the early morning, ordinary, the light coming in flat and honest through glass her father had installed himself. The bakery was hers. It had always been hers. It was just fully, completely, permanently hers now in a way that nothing could interrupt. She pulled out her phone and called the 3 families. The conversations were short. They had heard from the federal investigator already, but they hadn't heard from her, and she wanted them to hear from her. To know that the filing cabinet and the 22 years of correspondence and her father's handwritten note about the pattern he had seen had made it possible to name what had been done to all of them. The last call was the longest. A woman named Clara, 73 years old, who had lost a building her mother had owned. Who had spent 6 years believing it was her fault, that she had missed something legal, had failed to understand something she should have understood. Maggie listened to her for 11 minutes. Then said, "You didn't miss anything. They built it so you would think you missed something. That's how it worked. You didn't fail. They cheated." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then, "How did you find all of this?" "My father kept records," Maggie said. "He always said document what matters." She looked at the east wall and the photographs. He was right. After the calls, she stood at the counter and let the bakery be quiet around her for a few minutes. The second batch was cooling. The morning light had fully arrived. Clement Street outside was doing what it did every morning, beginning ordinary, indifferent to the fact that something had just permanently resolved in the building that had been on it for 31 years. She put the second batch in the display case. Unlocked the front door. Turned the sign. The first customer came in at 7:15 and ordered a croissant and a coffee and said nothing about federal investigations or port contracts or 22 years of documented fraud because she didn't know about any of it, and Maggie's bakery was simply, to her, the place on Clement Street that smelled good in the morning. Maggie served her with the specific satisfaction of a thing that had been worth serving. She was refilling the display case at 7:50 when the bell above the door rang again. He sat down without ceremony. No security visible. She had learned to check and had learned what his version of no security visible actually meant, which was that the perimeter had been established before he walked in and he trusted it enough to sit at a bakery counter without performing vigilance. He put both hands on the worn wood and looked at the chalkboard menu as though he had not read it already, which she understood was his version of giving her time. She set a coffee in front of him. He had not ordered. He had not told her how he took it. She had been paying attention for 2 weeks. He looked at the coffee. But the way he took it. He looked at her. "You didn't have to find me," she said, quoting something from the evening that had been building toward this counter since a marble corridor and a locked door. "I know," he said. Same answer as before. Said differently now. Carrying more weight, more history, the specific resonance of a thing said twice and meaning more the second time. She came around to the customer side of the counter because the counter between them had been useful during a crisis and was now simply a counter. She sat on the stool beside him. Outside, Clement Street was doing its mid-morning movement. A woman with a stroller, 2 people with coffee cups, a delivery truck making the turn onto the block. "The news broke an hour ago," Ethan said. "I know. I've had 4 texts from customers." She held her own coffee. "How bad is it for the Harrington family?" Richard Harrington's attorney is negotiating cooperation terms. The port contract is dead. The shipping consortium withdrew this morning once the federal case became public. He held her gaze. The organization's expansion plans, built around acquiring the Clement Street building as a footprint anchor, cannot proceed without that property. Without the port contract, the financing for the expansion collapses. He paused. Ashley has released a statement. It describes the situation as a misunderstanding of internal procedures. "A misunderstanding," Maggie said. "Yes. 22 years of deliberate property suppression is a misunderstanding. According to the statement," he said. She looked at her coffee. "Clara called me this morning. One of the 3 families. She spent 6 years thinking she had failed. That she'd missed something she should have caught." She held the mug in both hands. She hadn't. They built it so she would think that. Ethan held her gaze. Something moved across his face. The expression she had catalogued across 2 weeks of proximity, the one that arrived when something landed somewhere it was allowed to land. What did you say to her? He said. That she didn't fail, Maggie said. That they cheated. That there's a difference. She held his gaze. There's always a difference between those two things. Most people spend years confusing them. He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said. They do. She looked at the east wall. The photographs. Her father at the counter he had built. Her father was on the sidewalk outside on the day the sign went up. Her father's hands, flour-covered, the specific large-knuckled hands of a man who had built things and fixed things and kept records of everything. He would have liked you, she said. Not because she planned to say it. Because it was true and the bakery was the place she said true things. Ethan looked at the photographs. Why? Because you paid attention when something didn't add up, she said. He always said that's the most important thing, not being the smartest person in the room. Just being the one who notices when something doesn't add up and doesn't let it go. She held his gaze. You noticed a dessert table was unattended. You noticed I was missing. You didn't let it go. It seemed significant, he said. It was significant, she said. Most people don't treat it that way. He held her gaze. The controlled surface was entirely absent. What she saw was the direct, unmanaged version of him, the one that had arrived first on the terrace and had been arriving with increasing frequency since. The version that was not performing authority or restraint or the specific professional calm of a man who had built an organization around never being surprised. Maggie, he said. Yes. I've been at approximately 400 events in the last 15 years, he said. Galas, negotiations, charitable performances, business dinners. I have never once noticed what was on a dessert table. He paused. I noticed yours because it was empty when it shouldn't have been. And then I noticed you weren't there. And then the two things combined into something that I could not let go of. He held her gaze. I want you to understand that it had nothing to do with the property connection. I didn't know about Clement Street when I walked down that corridor. I know, she said. How? Because you told me about the property connection before you asked for the documentation, she said. You gave me information before you knew it would be useful to give me information. People who are being strategic don't do that. She held his gaze. You were just being honest. Because something had happened in a corridor that you thought I should know about. He held her gaze across the worn counter in the morning light with the butter smell and the photographs and the 2 weeks of everything else around them. I'm going to keep coming here, he said. Not for the situation. Not for anything connected to the case or the Harrington family or the port contract. He paused. For coffee. And because I want to. She looked at him. At the man who had come down a corridor she could not see, produced a key she had not asked for, and opened a door she could not open herself. Who had sat at her father's desk and read 30 years of records with the specific care of someone who understood what he was holding. Who had made phone calls she could not hear and handled things he would not describe in detail and had been present, consistently and completely, across 2 weeks of a situation that was not his responsibility. 7 o'clock, she said. That's when I made the first batch. The coffee is ready by 7:15. I'll be here at 7, he said. I know, she said. I'll have the coffee made. She held his gaze across the counter. He held hers. Outside, Clement Street moved through its morning with magnificent indifference to the fact that a woman who had been locked in a restroom 2 weeks ago was sitting in her father's bakery with the most powerful man in the city, having the most ordinary conversation of her life, which was somehow the most significant. The lesson settled the way real lessons did, not in the dramatic moment but in the quiet one that followed. The woman they had locked in a restroom had not needed rescuing. She had needed 48 minutes and a filing cabinet and the documentation habits her father had taught her. She had saved her own legacy, her father's building, and 3 other families' stories with records she had kept because she had been taught to keep them. Ethan Cross had simply refused to let her disappear. Nobody disappears when one person is paying attention. That was the truth underneath everything. The locked door, the fraudulent claims, the 22 years of deliberate suppression. All of it required the assumption that nobody would notice. That she would vanish without leaving a mark. She had left a filing cabinet's worth of marks. And a man who attended charity galas for business reasons had noticed a dessert table and followed the absence to a mahogany door and opened it. And everything that came after had come from that single act of paying attention. The coffee was good. The morning light was honest. The bakery smelled of her father and of showing up. She will be showing up tomorrow. And the day after. And all the days after that. So would he? Here is the question I cannot stop thinking about. Ethan Cross found Maggie because her dessert table was unattended. He came down that corridor partly because of the gala, partly because of the Harrington Port contract, and partly for a reason he himself couldn't fully explain. So I want to know, does a good act need a pure reason to be a good act? Or is what matters simply that someone showed up? Leave your answer below. I want to know where you stand on this. And if you want more stories about women who were never the problem, just the person nobody thought to look for, subscribe. The next story is already waiting.